thanks to all the participants and attendees who are going to be joining the session. We're very excited for it. So the session is called Corporate Strategies that Advance LGBT Human Rights, how purpose-driven corporations can use their positions and platforms to advance LGBT equality. Just as a reminder, the session is being recorded, and as you can see in the chat function, we have a couple of really amazing staff members who are helping with moderation. So feel free to throw in your questions, introduce yourself, and again, we'll get started in a minute or two. So first of all, want to just thank Herman Miller, Google, P&G, for joining, and Herman Miller and P&G specifically, who've been sponsors of Out Summit and Outright for a while. So we really want to thank you both. My name is Alap Shah. My pronouns are he and him. My day job is I lead product and platform at Capital One, especially for customers who've experienced hardship and who've gone through COVID-related challenges this past year. This is actually my favorite event of the entire year. It's very much a soothing balm, I consider, especially just given this past year. So before I ask the panelists to introduce themselves, we do have a poll. And so if anybody who is joining, I'll say it a couple times, we have a poll here in the Hopin platform. So if you are listening in, please go to the poll and click what sector you work in. And we'll kind of reveal the poll in a bit. It'd be helpful to also get a sense of that. So yeah. And so I think we have our fourth panelist just joined. That's great to hear. Welcome. Glad you're here, and hopefully it wasn't too difficult to join. So you're actually coming at the perfect time, which is I'd love to just have each of you take 30 seconds and introduce yourselves. And so name, preferred pronoun, your title, your role, your affiliation. And then one question is, what is the best thing you've made or eaten during, your shelter-in-place COVID-19 reality? So, Pedro, can I ask you to go first, please?
Oh boy. Okay. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here today. My name is Pedro Pina. My pronouns are he, him, his. With my day job, I'm a global VP for sales at Google, and I handle some of the largest advertisers of Google globally. So I have a team spread around the world to provide support for digital transformations of some of the biggest advertisers globally. One of them is sitting on this panel today. But that's my day job, and then I have other jobs, and one of them is to be the executive sponsor for all things diversity across EMEA, and also I'm the LGBTIQ chapter for EMEA as well. So all the Googlers who self-identify as LGBTQ roll up to me. So I have my little empire, which I'm very proud of, at Google. And I live right now in London with my husband, and we have a daughter, a 16-month daughter. And I've eaten a Whopper the other day for the first time in a long time because somehow we didn't have time to cook. Somehow we didn't have time to prepare, and we wanted something different. I said, a Whopper is something different. I hadn't touched a Whopper in the last 5 years. So it was delicious. And
hey, I think we're all doing a lot of new things this year.
Exactly. For me, this was really big and new. So it was great.
Yeah. Well, thank you again.
Thanks again for having me.
Ben?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Watson. My preferred pronouns are he, him, his. My days are spent many days working as the Chief Creative Officer at Herman Miller. And in that role, I'm fortunate to manage the teams that design, develop, and bring to market all of our products for all of our brands. So that's not just Herman Miller, but other brands active around the globe, such as Design Within Reach or Hey or Maharam. And I also have the opportunity to lead to be the sponsor for our LGBTIQ equity teams around the world. So that's a big passion of mine. I'm ringing in today from my apartment in New York. I split my time between here and our corporate headquarters, which are in Michigan. although there's, of course, been less traveling this year. Maybe picking up on Pedro's theme, my partner Henry and I had our first meal out, so we've been cooking a lot. But it was, for if anyone else ringing in from New York knows, it's been a cold week, and we ate outside on a 32-degree night on Monday because we were desperate to have a burger from our favorite pub around the corner on Waverly Place. So that felt really special because we hadn't had a meal out for 9 months. So it was a fun treat.
And then Alexandra?
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm Alex Keith. I lead, well, my preferred pronouns are she, her, hers. I am not a member of the community, but I have been an ally for a very, very long time. I lead Procter & Gamble's global beauty business, so brands that you are probably have heard of before: Pantene, Head & Shoulders, Olay, SK2 are some of our brands. But I also am Procter & Gamble's corporate commercial sponsor for our LGBTIQ plus community of employees. And as part of that, I lead the vertical that really leverages our brands and our brand voice and platforms around the world to bring forward insight, conversation, and to reflect this community in the advertising that we have and the messages that we put into the markets around the world. So I'm very proud of the work our teams do around the world, and not only in advertising, but in a lot of the partnerships we have. I'm sure we'll talk more about those today. And thanks for having us here.
That's great. Thank you all. Thank you all so much. Really excited. You know, I'll take a minute and say, like, you know, I think we are living in an extraordinary time, both challenging and resilient. And, you know, you three, I think, come from really interesting backgrounds, and we're really excited to hear your perspective, because the private sector, as we all know, has made, on one hand, lots of important progress, right, to improve inclusion, diversity, and access within companies, and have often, as we know from many ways we've heard in news, you know, have created social change and influence outside the company as well. But there are understandably a lot of challenges and questions and even critiques, right? And so we'd love to kind of get your guys' perspective on that. And then again, as we talked a lot during yesterday's sessions too, this year alone is very unique. COVID-19 in the US and around the world, a real reckoning around racial justice. And despite progress that we've seen, a real, you know, unequal treatment of LGBTIQ people in their everyday lives, especially around discrimination, both inside and outside of the workplace. But as we know, time and time again, and, you know, Alex, you kind of alluded to, like, you know, workplaces are better when people can bring their whole selves to work. And I think there's a importance around mitigating bias and authenticity that shows up. And we have seen the impact it has, again, on social movements, but even within companies, the real bottom line impact, purchasing power, talent acquisition and retention, branding, and so forth. And so I'd love to, like, you know, use the next 50 minutes to talk about, that intersectional lens, you know, who has privilege and who has access, and how do we connect human rights and social progress and corporate value. And the second one is, you know, understanding corporate sector's role and your guys' view of its role, and what considerations and levers are available, especially for people who are listening in, and how they can meaningfully engage. And so my first question is to you, Alex. I think you already hit on this a little bit, which is, there is an awareness of the role businesses can play, right? It's growing, it's evolving, it's challenging. And so in addition to some of the products and services, you know, how is P&G thinking about connecting these different identities, the customer, the employee, the shareholder, and the general public, when we think about the LGBT lens?
Absolutely, and maybe I should acknowledge I didn't say that I'm based in Geneva, Switzerland, so it is already dark here. And during the lockdown, I have eaten an insane amount of Swiss chocolate, so I forgot that part of my answer. So look, I think corporations can play an incredibly important role here. And as we think about it at P&G, and we think about equality and inclusion, we really start first with our own employee base and workforce. We want our employee base and workforce to reflect the consumers we serve around the world. We want to have the insights. We want to have people see themselves in our advertising, in our products that we create, and those type of things. To do that, we need to create an environment, and we want to do that because that's good for business. When consumers can see themselves in your brand and in your product, they want to be part of it. But that starts by creating an environment where LGBTQ people feel welcome, feel included, feel they can bring their best selves to work. And so our E&I programs really start inside, and then they go outside with partnerships, with advertising, with sparking conversations, with influencing governments where we can, and really trying to create environments that are good for our employees and good for the general population of our consumers.
That's great. And do you feel like there's ever, a conflict or tension between those two realities, right? Which is what is good for the business, can or cannot be good for, social movements. I mean, have you felt that tension at all kind of as you've been navigating some of these spaces?
I can't say that I have. I think we are very, very focused on serving the world's consumers and reflecting the diversity of the world's consumers. We're not perfect, but we've made a lot of progress over many, many years and led in many, many ways across the spectrum of discussion of equality and inclusion. In other places, we still have a ways to go. So, but I think ultimately, if we focus on reflecting the consumer base in the world, there's not a tension with the business need.
Yeah. So Ben, I'll ask you the next question, which is I think you alluded to as well. Like there are lots of operations where Herman Miller exists and operates, and we know that obviously rights vary greatly by country and jurisdiction. Everything from legal recognition to marriage to, the death penalty. And so, taking, just where you sit, like, where do companies play a role in that understanding as they operate in countries that might have this varying degree? Are there short-term or long-term opportunities or challenges that you've seen be successful within Herman Miller, or just in general from your observation?
You bet. I think it might be valuable if I can to build right where Alex was a moment ago, right. In that the work starts inside and then from inside steps outside. And I think very, very similarly, we focus on that work first. And we really put a ton of energy into our employee-led equity teams, which are active not just in the space of LGBTIQ equality, but in racial and gender equity and others as well, of course. But those employee-led teams not only become us, I think as Alex was describing, a sounding board for us as to how we can be our best selves as a corporate organization, but also give us guidance on on how we show up outside. So if I step outside for a second, that helps us be appropriately active, genuinely active in our outside communities, which are different for every organization, of course. So for us, it might be participating in or creating local pride events in cities throughout the world, or participating in DIFA events, which are close to the design industry in which we operate. But I think that stretches me then to maybe the meatier part of your question, Alap, which is in those places that are further away or where rights are harder to come by. Let's be frank. Is that we still always start inside, but there's one of our core values at Herman Miller is that we're better together. Mm-hmm. And we really both build a bridge of our equity teams, and our LGBTIQ teams has chapters all around the world, from Bangalore to Mexico City, as well as in Chicago and New York. And those teams help us be connected, not just to one another, but mm-hmm. connected in their local community and how they can be most effective and most powerful. So I think that connectivity happens on a grassroots level. I think that's in each community where we're active. And it's in our community of our network. So for us, it's our suppliers, our distributors, and indeed our customers. Are we being genuine with them about our stand on human rights and LGBTIQ rights? So I think we have that sense of community. And the second part is like, we realize that as a company, we have a voice we can use.
Sure, right.
And I think that's a voice not just that can reach others that we're close to, but that can be active politically as well.
Yeah. I was looking the other day, and I think, Herman Miller CEO had said something along the lines of, if we are not inclusive, we are not competitive. And I really love that, because again, it really talks about companies are really driving the idea of competitive advantage, talent, and there's a lot of options for consumers and people, and something there that felt really resonant. And so Ben, do you imagine that there's a little bit of, again, an understanding that what's good for the business, or what's good for LGBT is good for businesses. Do you see a big disconnect between what happens within a company and what you can kind of control, if you will, and kind of what happens to that individual as they step outside of the Herman Miller bubble and goes back to the daily life in these countries?
Yeah. I think, again, building on the comment that Alex used, if I can, we have a long history of, from our founding CEO, of encouraging every employee to bring their full selves to work. And then I think that's a phrase that really resonates with our community. And so that you can't separate your, quote, work self from your out of work self. You're still yourself.
Yeah.
And whether we're thinking about that in the benefits that we're extending to our employees, no matter where they are, that those are consistent, unless they're constrained by local law. But that the more that we adopt that attitude first, that creates a, quote, safe place for our employees everywhere, even in more challenged locations.
That's great. Thank you. So Pedro, I'd love to turn it to you next, which is, I think, both, your role, as well as I think, as we know, Google has, a large presence in lots of countries, and, local LGBT groups in countries probably, may face discriminatory laws and practices, right? But then there is this global presence that you and your company brings. Would love to just hear any examples or best practices you've heard around, where Google is investing in the community, where they're trying to advance local solutions, and just places that you've seen real success in that partnership of global versus global plus local. Excuse me.
Yeah, of course. Like Alex and Ben mentioned before, our company, it's very public about the commitment with the community and how the importance of diversity how important diversity is for our own business strategy. And this directive comes directly from the top. The way the CEO articulates it is, we want to be a reflection of the users we serve, very, very similar to what Alex articulated before. And there's no really an option to this, really. And we don't do it only to advance business reasons. Is really truly because it's the right thing to do, and it's at the very core, at the heart of what we do on a day-to-day basis. Now, Google it's a very, very big company, has lots of services, it has a massive reach, and we have plenty of evidence that our tools have been incredible in building a sense of community and connecting this community that so much needs to feel that they're together and feel safety in numbers. To give you some numbers, since 2014, we've had 8 billion queries just around LGBT topics. We have more than 3 million hours of video uploads on YouTube associated to LGBTQ topics, and stuff around discovery and awareness of whether you're gay or not, and what do I do when I find out that I'm gay, has grown 54% in the last years. During coming out day, things having, queries around coming out day have increased around 60%, and finding a community around 70%. We have more than 250,000 YouTubers, YouTube creators, that have posted content either around their own coming out or about coming out of their community. So people use our platforms and our tools to actually find comfort, finding their words, finding identity, create a community. You'd be surprised, but where we have the heart, some of the biggest volume of queries and video activity and connectivity happens to be on countries which are not known as being friendly to the LGBT community. So up there we have the Belaruses, the Russias, the Hungaries, the Chinas. I mean, we that's where people come to the internet and to tools such as Google and platforms to actually find their own identity, find comfort in numbers, and create a community. So we believe we have something to do and to say about this, and this alone has created a connecting tissue, which has made the social movement in those countries stronger and harder at grassroots, which is where it starts. And then our corporations come on top, like Google comes and with its embassy model of, with its own brand and presence in the country, just models behavior of acceptance and inclusion. And, we don't necessarily want to force things in. That's not our place to force social change, but we model the benefits of an inclusive environment. And every single employee at Google knows that the moment they walk inside the walls of Google, they can be their best selves. They are protected. And that's what we call the embassy model, which really works around the world and works especially in the countries where the physical integrity and the emotional integrity of LGBTQ members is typically strained outside of our walls.
I love that. You said a lot there. And so first of all, this is a great introduction. No, actually in a good way, actually. So I have like a lot of questions. I'm trying to think of which one to ask first. Yeah. So I think the first question I'd like to ask you, Pedro, is actually around Pride events, right? Which has a lot of, again, value, but some challenges, let's be honest, right? Around, do companies only show up during Pride? And I'd love to get your sense of what Google did this year, given there were no physical Prides happening. And were there things that were successful or not so successful, given there wasn't the ability for companies to slap a logo on a float and go down a street? Yeah. And I think, again, I'd love to kind of get some thoughts on that from you. And Ben and Alice, please chime in as well if you have some thoughts from your company.
Sure. We've been a huge sponsor of Prides around the world. And in fact, I handle all the effort in the region of EMEA for Prides. And we organize roughly 25 to 28 Prides every year, just in Europe, and with a presence on the street. And this year, of course, we had to move digitally. We created an event which was mostly concentrated, mostly thought through to bring the community together inside the company, because that's what we wanted to make sure. We knew that the working from home and the lockdown period we were going through was going to put in a tremendous stress in our LGBT community. We do know that for a lot of people, going back home is not necessarily a good thing. We know that for some of our people, working from home is not a good thing. And so and we know that a lot of people find their community and they become their best selves, using Ben's expression, when they come to work. Sometimes going back home at the end of the day is not amazing. And so we knew we needed to take care of the community this year. And we dedicated all our efforts to make sure that top management was there for them, was reaching out and making sure that we would be there, we would be with them throughout the period and after the period as well. So that was our focus this year. But Google has been a huge sponsor of Pride for a long, long time. We actually created the with our Google Arts and Culture project, we created the history, a digital version of the history of Pride in order to memorialize and, quite frankly, internalize this story and make sure that is accessible to everyone, and how what the birth of Pride felt like since the beginning. And for us, it's a huge investment we want to continue to do, mostly because it's a way to establish clearly in a public way what Google is about, what the brand stands for. But it's also an internal event, funny enough, because who goes on the float, which we ask top leadership to come on the float, sends a massive signal, not only to the LGBT community, which feels that they have allies to support them, but also it sends a signal to everyone else that top leadership, being LGBT a member or not, is showing what a role model they should all be. So Pride is huge for us. Now, on the topic of should brands just slap their logo or not, in this day and age of social media, if there's an inconsistency between the marketing and the internal policies of companies, consumers find out and they out the companies. So personally, I'm not worried at all like that. I wish when I was a child, I wish when I was a young teenager, trying to understand who I was. I wish my retail bank, I wish my food, fast food company or my cafe around the door would slap a rainbow on their logo, even if they didn't mean it. To me, it would mean massive acceptance. To me, it would mean, my God, day-to-day brands are reaching out to me, even for commercial purposes. Fine. These days, if they do that and they're not consistent with their internal policies, consumers will out them, and that'll be a 1 year effort, and that's
great. Yeah.
And by the way, if they get outed and because of that there's change that happens in these companies, even better.
Yeah, that's right. Ben or Alice, anything to add there? Just by thinking about, again, the critique around companies and Pride, and again, thoughts of what? Yeah.
We have been a longtime supporter of Pride, and our chapters, our LGBTQ employee chapters around the world are active and powerful participants. This year, we did something really special, I think, that's worth talking about. So, particularly given the racial justice conversations that were happening in the U.S., coupled with COVID, a lot of companies backed out of Pride and Pride events and Pride support. And of course, a lot of organizations receive quite a bit of their funding every year via Pride events. At P&G, we see really the intersectionality of all of these challenges that have come to the forefront in E&I, and we don't think that you can choose one over the other because we need to reflect all of our consumers. So our team, I'm super proud of our P&G team. They put together an event called Cancel Pride, leveraging a lot of our media partnership. It was put together on extremely fast timing, but it became a media platform. And because it was virtual, we were able to reach a tremendously higher number of people around the world. And we had names like Sia and Katy Perry, Adam Lambert, Melissa Etheridge. I mean, we had some big name talents performing at Can't Cancel Pride. So we think that we were able to reach maybe even some LGBTQ younger people who had never been part of a Pride event, never really had that opportunity. So we really think that Pride is a point of entry into the conversation. And we think the virtual platform, frankly, has merit going forward almost as an incremental thing to the parades and the events that happen in a non-virtual world. So we're pretty excited about that. And of course, some of the outcome of Can't Cancel Pride strengthened our partnership with Outright as well. So we're really happy that we were able to do that.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to ask like one kind of broad question, and then I see a bunch of notes, a bunch of chat questions I might bring in a little bit. But so, it's hard to ignore, what's happened this past year. And we know that in times of crisis or disaster this year or in previous years, vulnerable populations are further disproportionately marginalized and impacted. It includes women, people of color, minorities, LGBTIQ, of course. And there has been some questions, again, and a challenge around norms, privilege, institutions, and even leadership, right? And so we saw some of these questions kind of baked in here, but I think we'll start here and kind of address some other ones, which is, what have your companies done differently? What have you committed to stay the course around in terms of inclusion and anti-racism? And how has that impacted either your employee engagement, your products and services, and or your commitment to social justice? And what can we do better? Maybe is a good question too. So lots of questions in there. Would love to have maybe Ben, if you want to start. Would love to hear from all of you.
Sure. I think a few really important themes come to mind when you challenge us with that question. One is that obviously, to state the obvious, the events of the focus on racial justice and indeed all justice globally has been felt everywhere and has certainly been felt inside every corporation as much as it is or should be if on any corporation that wants to survive. And I think the activities that we undertook at Herman Miller, again, if I go back to, were values driven, which were let's be honest and be transparent with ourselves and with our community about where we're not measuring up to what we believe we could, how we could stand or show up every day. And so I was thinking about that a moment ago when Pedro was talking about the stickers on the door and the rainbow washing. It's actually being transparent about where you're happy you're doing good work and being transparent about where you're really not happy with how you're doing. And I think that's been very important to us in these last months as we think about our commitments to diversity and inclusion of all peoples.
Yep.
And being clear, particularly in spaces where I'm active, is the diversity of our design partnership that we work with around the globe, what it could or should be? No. So are we giving ourselves concrete goals and measuring ourselves against them? Yes, we are. And it's going to be really hard, but we're going to be transparent about where the wins we make, but also the places where we have a ton of work to do. And I think that's, again, I was thinking of it when Pedro was sharing his story, is that people will sniff out jive in a second.
Sure.
And so there's never more important time than in this time to be transparent and be clear, state the ambition clearly, and then hold yourself accountable to the word.
Maybe I can build on that a little bit.
Please.
So the beauty industry was maybe even more at the forefront of a lot of the conversations on racial justice and equality, given within the beauty industry and in other industries too. But brands become a personal. People have a personal connection to the brands, maybe more so than in some other consumer product categories. So we were at the forefront of these conversations, and we have a broad platform called Responsible Beauty, and one of the pillars of that is E&I, and is using our brand platforms to bring forward insights and spark conversations in the area of gender equality, racial equality, and LGBTQ equality. And frankly, when the racial justice movement really got hot over the summer in the US, we really took a hard look. We put together a small team that took a hard look at which of our brands had the relevance, the resonance, and the equity to talk authentically in this space. And that group of people, which was a diverse group of people representing the external world, guided our brands to make sure that when we went and spoke and provided messaging and inspiration, that it was authentic, it was real, and if people looked inside, they would see people on the inside that reflected the people we were talking to. And that was a fascinating exercise for many of our brands, but it really resulted in some powerful work that is really, I give one example. Our Olay brand had always been focused for quite some time as a purpose on gender equality in STEM. But as the racial equality and justice discussions came forward, they doubled down on that commitment because they realized that only 5% of people in STEM are women of color. So they doubled down on that, making partnerships and contributions to the United Negro College Fund, and it culminated very recently in Macy's Thanksgiving Day float with a woman on our float who was an African ancestry woman. She's not real; she's huge. Astronaut with natural hair and braids. And I received a handwritten note in the mail from someone who had seen that parade and said, you know, images matter. When young Black girls see a Black astronaut on the Olay float, it changes their dreams and can change what they go after. And I think it's just a wonderful example. But we wanted to make sure we could bear the looking in. Not all of our brands did things like that. I mean, so.
Pedro, any thoughts?
Yeah, what a wonderful story. Yeah, I mean, what I would add is clearly this summer there was this reckoning with something that has already was existing for a long, long time. And it was a long time coming, but somehow the fact that we could see live in front of us, in front of what the community knew for a long time was happening, all of a sudden became broadcast in a stark way for the population, not only in the US, but around the world. And there was clearly something that happened that was different from before. Something that, you know, you can see that on Amazon sales of books around understanding racial injustice or, around white fragility, white privilege. I mean, there was this rush to self-education like I've never seen before. The amount of programming that TV started generating and other channels started generating, the amount of content that started being poured into social media platforms as well as traditional platforms has been quite remarkable. And we could see this happening inside Google for sure. And the one thing that it triggered was this idea of waking up this concept of allyship. Alexandra just introduced herself as an ally, but quite frankly, a year ago, people would say I'm an ally, and people did not even understand what that meant, let alone the importance of it. And the one thing that happened this summer was this awakening for the concept of allyship and this idea that the racial injustice is so systemic that you have to go back to those who built the system if you want to address it. And so we have to end this permanent ask of the Black plus population to come and fix it. You have to turn to the white population and ask the white population to fix. And it reminded us all that if women can vote was because they fought for it, but it was because of parliaments full of men approved laws for women to vote. Those who hold power are the ones who have to say, if I was able to marry another man was because a parliament full of heterosexual people voted for that. So it's the responsibility of the majority to come and fix it and fight for social justice. So what happened this summer was actually this 180-degree change where all of a sudden people realize that actually those in the majority or considered in the majority are the ones who actually have to fight for racial justice, not the underrepresented groups. And this is a huge change. And we've seen that happen across Google. So the amount of ERGs, employee resource groups that started being flooded with allies, the amount of top executives that wanted to become executive sponsors of allies, the amount of money that started pouring into a lot of activities about inclusion and closing the gap on just social justice, generically speaking, not only racial. Of course, Google, like a lot of other companies, put out serious and public and transparent commitments about contributing to closing the racial justice, but beyond that was actually touched all the underrepresented groups, in fact, because there was this awakening that actually the majority needed to start being part of the solution and not sitting idly expecting for change to be incremental.
I think what said, all three of you said really important points, really great. I think I'm going to try to ask a question, maybe two-part, that threads some of the questions I've seen in the chat, right? So we talk a lot at companies about, D&I, diversity and inclusion and belonging initiatives. Even then, there's two questions I want to pose, and you can figure out how to answer it. But so one is there's always a challenge of who gets access to those jobs, and thinking about vulnerable and marginalized people and what they can do to get in front of or get opportunities that historically haven't been available to them, right? So that's kind of one part of the idea of diversity and inclusion. The other part is maybe an equity one, which we've seen kind of some questions around, is what is the obligation or what is your stance on whether it's diversity quotas or the idea that, as you go up the chain, as Pedro, you kind of alluded to, leadership starts looking very homogenous and very normative. And, whether it's the C-suite or the board, they're making decisions that have huge impacts. And are there representation of people in those, or is there an allyship or understanding of it, right? And so there are a couple of questions in the chat that allude to, but I'd love to get in either side of that equation, thoughts on what you've seen, what we think we should be doing, and what your companies have been or how they've been approaching it.
Yeah.
Maybe I would say when I talked about representing the consumer base we serve, that is not just at our new hire class. We ultimately need to make sure that representation and the face of our consumers through our executive levels, and we track that, and we have accountability amongst our leadership for that. We aren't everywhere we want to be yet, but I think having awareness, accountability, and causing those discussions, it plays a bit into the first part of your question, because when we have an open job or an open role for someone mid-level management, making sure the slate of candidates reflects people of different races and genders and sexual orientation, and we don't always know the last one, right? It's not it's especially in a lot of countries, we may not know. But the fact of the matter is that we are being very, very deliberate about making sure that representation and the face of the consumer is through the levels of our company, and I think that makes a big difference to our employee base and to our consumer and our business.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm happy.
Ben,
sorry,
please,
Ben, go ahead. Yeah.
No, please.
Pedro, please.
Just I would say a couple of things. One is what we found out about the topics you're raising around the difficulty of representation is that this thing is hard to address, and here's a couple of things we know. Number one is this whole issue of diversity and inclusion gets a lot of excitement at board level, a lot of excitement at top level, top executive C-suite loves it and wants to reaffirm the values of companies, and lots of excitement at grassroots levels. Usually entry-level employees get excited and hot about this topic. The issue is the piece in the middle, and managers, so people managers, team leaders are actually the ones that can transform the face of a company, because they're the ones that hire, they are the ones that reshape their organizations. They're the one who give best opportunities and projects and assignments to people. They're the ones who promote people. They're the ones who actually can change the face of an organization. So sometimes we see a lot of companies spending a lot of time on the top, getting CEOs to say all the right things, and they do, and they honestly believe in them. I mean, that's the values of the company, and lots of grassroots stuff happening. But what's really, really hard is to crack in the middle, to go in and say, all right, let's go to the engine of how we hire. Let's go to the engine on how we performance evaluate. How do we promote people? How do we hire alone? It's a full-time job. You have to revisit your pools. Where are you sourcing your talent? How do you evaluate? How do you build your panels? I mean, if I'm a black a person, and who's going to be going on a string of interviews with 8 people that are white men, what does that say for my chance? How do I feel about it? And how do I feel this company represents, and how do I feel I'm going to fit into this company? So it is actually very, very unsexy work, which is actually have to go into the underbelly of the recruiting and the staffing and the HR procedures and processes, and to try to change that at scale, which is a brutal effort. And that has to happen. So what I've seen is change happens when, beyond just saying all the right things, you go into this detail, you actually start driving this. And the people that have to give the mandate to drive those changes have to really come from the top. So and you have to track it. And you have to make it a business problem. So that's the one thing we've learned, is that we started seeing change the moment we address representation like a business problem. And a business problem, like all of us are in business, depends on how you define it, how you determine it, how do you KPI it, how you put a project against it, how you define a gap, how you track the metrics. There's a rigor and a discipline on addressing diversity and inclusion and representation, which is not different from the rigor and discipline of increasing your market share in a given market. It's exactly the same type of business discipline that is required.
That's right. And Ben, I think I'd love to get your thoughts. And what one thing is, maybe, are there examples of how, Herman Miller has mitigated that bias, as kind of Pedro alluded to?
Thanks for that lead-in, and I think it's exactly some thoughts that I was jotting down. If I were to certainly nod my head to the thoughts that Alex and Pedro shared. Some activities we've undertaken is yes, we have to clearly articulate our ambitions from the very top. So to Andy Owen, our CEO, she's done a superb job in being very vocal and clear. You need to model that behavior at the very top of the organization, from the boardroom on down, and cascade the responsibilities to Pedro, to your the really unsexy part. Demand the same approach to full slates of candidates, to measuring and looking hard at what how our populations at every level of the organization measure up and self-identify, and are we honestly reflecting? And that means we have to do the unsexy work of, are we looking in the same old places for potential candidates, or do we have to do the work to go in places where, quote, we're not used to working or looking? I think that the second piece of work that I'd call attention to is that the one thing I'm really excited about that our HR leadership teams undertook beginning in the summer was a weekly program called The Lens, where all of our 8,000 employees around the country, or around the world, can come together for a conversation about topics on race, diversity, and inclusion. And if those began very much racially centric, they've grown to talk about diversity and inclusion more broadly, and grown into a program where we're now delivering training on mitigating bias to every one of our employees, beginning at the top and cascading to every level of the organization. That's a huge commitment of time and energy, but it's already paying huge rewards. And what I'm so excited to hear it from Pedro, that the allyship growth bubble is an anomaly in our organization, that's actually happening everywhere. And I think that's super exciting. And those things have to become not just that the third part of the to-do is to sustain. We can't do a bunch of work and look at this once, because it's going to be a long road of nose down behavioral change,
right,
to make the systemic changes we need to make. So organizations are going to have to be committed long term to doing the work.
And I think there's and like this year shown, people are hungry, they're angry, they're committed, and we all need to understand our own privilege and our own place of where we have to do the hard work, to all of your points. So I'm going to try to ask a question that kind of weaves a couple of questions here in the chat, which is moving from more internal to now external, right? There's, again, a lot of challenges and critiques of what companies are doing as they look at the social lens or the social justice lens. One is obviously around lobbying on both sides of the spectrum that we know companies do. There is the shying away from potentially challenging international human rights abuses, either ignoring it or deciding not to divert investments in those places. And so, it's an open question. Would love to get, your three perspectives around how do companies, or how do you navigate that reality that, there is a little bit of questions that the LGBT people are asking about, hey, what kind of message are you sending when you have this duality of experiences?
I could start.
Sure.
Look, as I said, we, first of all, the Google brand is very well known, and the company's values are very well known. And as I said, we believe in the what we call the embassy model, which means that when we are present in a country, everyone knows what we stand for. Everyone knows what our employees, what values we embrace, and what we expect from our employees, also from a value standpoint. So this is very well known. And the second point is, it's a philosophical question to understand what should be the roles of companies. Should they be an example and a role model as they implant themselves in other countries that are not perfect? And what is the definition of perfection really here? Because this is I wonder if each and every country, including those that we just assume that there are no blind spots. Let's start with the US, the UK, France. Are we saying that these countries are models of behavior versus the
in a Western colonial lens?
Exactly, versus the usual suspect of it's easy to talk about the usual suspects far away and point to fingers without noticing that inside our own countries. Well, actually, George Floyd was the ultimate example of this, right? It was under our nose. And so the big question is, what is the role of companies? Should they just be role models everywhere and show what good looks like and expect through that to make change happens? I think so. And that's actually what we're seeing happening around the world. And yes, there are some red lines to be defined. And so those red lines vary per business and per country. But generically speaking, we've seen, if we take a hard look of the last 10 to 15 years, progress has been incredibly positive, and a lot has to do with a network of multinationals that have expanded their presence around the world.
Ben? Anything to add? I have a spot there. I apologize. If not, Alex as well. I apologize.
Yes, please.
No, I was just going to say, I agree with Pedro's points. I think we really focus on one, bringing the conversations forward and leveraging the relationships we have to lobby where appropriate and those type of things. But our first priority, and this was maybe talked a little bit earlier, but is the safety of our employees. So in those countries where maybe the environment outside the P&G office that you had asked about before, when our employees leave, if that environment is such where is illegal or there's a lot of negative energy around the whole topic of LGBTQ, we we don't do the kinds of things that we are doing in other markets, like with our Pantene Hair Has No Gender, transgender platform that we're bringing forward, because we want our employees to be safe. And we are now rolling out around the world a new HR-based platform where LGBTQ employees can self-identify if they so choose, so that we will have a much better picture of our employee base and which of our employees are members of the community, so that we can make sure that we have their safety and support for them in mind if they are in some of these countries and places where the environment is frankly much more challenging. So
Sure.
I would just say, through that lens, that's the way I would think about it.
I'll add one example. I know we're kind of coming on time here, but at Capital One, I believe there are now 5,000 plus individuals who are on a Slack channel that is specifically addressing social and anti-racial justice issues, and have now done everything from writing letters to our board and to our CEO and holding them accountable. And as someone I called out, employees and individuals are aware of everything that companies are doing, and they're going to call them out when lobbying money goes in a way that does not represent both the mission as well as the individuals that work for these companies. And I think, look, this is a conversation that's not going to end, and it's not perfect. And I think Pedro called it out, which is there's a real question around the role of companies, the role of civic and civil and governments, and the role of individuals. And that tension and that partnership is always going to be evolving. So I think in my last minute or two that I have, what does the future look like? And I can ask that for yourself individually, or as you represent your companies. We'd just love to kind of ask you guys, what does the future look like, and how can people here listening really think about that as they engage?
I might jump in quickly.
Please.
Because the word that comes to mind for me is that I look at the future with optimism. And I believe that that's well-founded in terms of the collective energy. We talked about allyship, we talked about corporate commitments, we talked about awareness that all has grown so much, and that we're in a unprecedented place. Those things give me optimism about the advances that we can make as a civil society, and indeed, not just in the decades ahead, but in the years and months ahead.
I would just say we are working both internally to P&G and externally in all of the markets where we're present for a much more equal future. And I am also optimistic because the conversations that have been raised, especially over the course of the last year, starting in the US, but with wide-ranging implications across the world, are sticking. They have not been a flash in the pan. They are causing conversations like this, and I therefore am optimistic we will have a more equal world as we go forward.
Pedro?
Yeah, I would say it's a journey. It's a marathon. It's a very long marathon, but it's going in the right direction. And we are, as far as Google is concerned, we are not perfect. And answering to some of the chats that were quick to put some information regarding how we are not perfect. We're not perfect, but we are transparent about the journey we're making. We are probably one of the few companies that issues a diversity report that it's made public to everyone. Our efforts, sometimes we fail, sometimes we succeed. We are humble about the journey we're making, and we're looking at this from a long-term perspective, and we're very proud of the journey we've made so far. But we're very far from being perfect, and we're learning as we go along, like everybody else. And as long as we're transparent about the trajectory we want to make, the direction we want to take, and where we want to be, I think we're in a good space. So I'm equally, like Ben, very optimistic about what's coming up. So
I think we're at time. First of all, thank you so much. I mean, I really appreciate your engagement, your words, your context. This is a never-ending conversation, so I really appreciate your engagement. I think we have a lot of work to do, but I'm also very hopeful. Thank you for all the attendees. I believe there is an evaluation being posted in the chat, so please feel free to fill it out. And onward, right? So thank you very much, and
Thank you for inviting
and
me.
I wish you all a good end of the year.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.